I would rather share one lifetime with you than face all the ages of this world alone. Familiar? But of course, that is a line from the well-loved novel by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings. Magandang araw po sa inyo. Welcome sa isa na naman pong episode ng online series ni Inang Pamantasan kung saan ang pagkatuto ay walang hanggan. Ito ang PNU Talks. My name is Erly Parungao Callueng, guro sa Faculty ng mga Sining at Wika at ako ang inyong Learning from Home buddy sa episode na ito. This episode is titled The Meditations on the Teaching of Classics in the Contemporary Times. The movie quote I recited at the beginning of this talk revolves around two powerful abstractions that have paved the way for much of civilization: love and life, or their counterparts, hate and death. From the lines in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, to John Green's The Fault in Our Stars, to Jennifer Niven's All the Bright Places, to practically almost every contemporary novel that's been translated into motion pictures, it couldn't escape us how these writers are almost always able to strike a chord in our young hearts, as if we are Arwen and Aragorn, or Hazel and Gus, or Violet and Finch. We rejoice in their triumphs and we commiserate in their pain. We like them for their audacity, but we love them for their vulnerability. We're endeared by their imperfection. We are reminded of our own. We are truly mesmerized by contemporary novels because they evidently impact our current lived experiences. They feed our imagination. This talk is focused on the beauty of engaging, or re-engaging for that matter, with the unquestionable beauty of the imagined world, painted by the poets and breathed into life in the classroom by our very own lit teachers. Through brief meditations on the value of the classics, that is archaic, lengthy, in some cases winding, but nevertheless always profound works of literature, we hope to impart a glorious reason to return to the books, to fiction, to poetry, and rediscover what it means to love and to live. If you are a lit teacher who is troubled by the seeming failing promise of teaching literature to inspire appreciation and understanding of our current lived experiences, this talk is for you. I would love to interact and hear your thoughts and insights, so please do drop them down in the comment section. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, sordid root. Such are the first four lines of the 1807 poem by the British Romantic poet William Wordsworth. Centuries and centuries from the time it was first written, we could not help but relate to every word this poem makes. Written around the rise of the Industrial Revolution, Wordsworth pondered on the sordid boon that was then just looming. Now, with technology perpetually on the rise, with people constantly tipping and tapping at their smartphones, we could not deny the immensity of his biting criticism. Because of that, we are today spending some time together to seek wisdom from the masterpieces, like the world is too much with us, and perhaps make better sense of this modernizing and neo-globalizing world, to reconcile the differences in thought and in feelings between the old world based on the classics and the new world based on contemporary works, to have a date with poets from the ancient to the present times, to marry the old and the new using innovative strategies for all teachers of lit, for all lit teachers. Let us begin with why we need to read classics in the modern or contemporary times when, obviously, there are more relevant options. Traditionally, in my masterworks in world lit classes, I would begin with a similar question. Why should we bother to read works that have existed long before we have? What are we to get from the forlorn existence of Emily Dickinson? Why should we waste our time with the complicated Old English of Shakespeare? Who actually cares about Plato's Caves, Aristotle's Poetics, Longinus' The Sublime, Sappho and her fragments? Wait, a Sappho existed? A her? A she? These are all the kinds of questions I would raise, and my students have all the best answers in the world. First, we read the classics because it's free. It's our free ticket to the world. Second, we read the classics because they free us. They emancipate us from all the tyrannies of the world, from ignorance, from apathy. And third, we read the classics because they are timeless, boundless, universal. On to the first reason. We read the classics because they're free. They're our free ticket to the world. We are all thrilled, aren't we, by the possibility of time travel? We wonder how it feels to wear those fashionable Victorian gowns and crowns. No wonder Bridgerton is quite a hit. We are intrigued by the power dynamics in Dante's Florence, Italy, that he decided some of them, himself included, are going to take a trip all the way to Inferno country. We are baffled by the question to be or not to be, open quote, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them. This soliloquy is most of us. There's a Hamlet in each of us whenever we are on edge, and all that there is uncertainty. Reading the masterpieces is like stepping on the precipice of human civilization. If we are lucky, we will see what should make us proud of who we are, or what we are, just by jumping into the world of the imagined, with our wild fancy as our unlimited visa. We get to endure the presence of a few caterpillars, those of us who wish to be acquainted with the butterflies. Yes, indeed, that's the Little Prince who said that. Educator and writer Dr. Hanin Abad paints a more vivid picture when he said that reading is a liberating art, that we read literature because it humanizes, and among all the things that humanize, it humanizes best, because it cultivates the feeling of life and imagination. Indeed, when we read Homer and pondered on the life warriors lived, it becomes too real, it's terrifying. The heroes so alive, we mourn their deaths. When Hector bid Andromache goodbye, we remember all those times our dear loved ones bid us goodbyes. To work, to make some sacrifice, never sure if they're ever coming back. Like the loving father, son, and brother that Prince Hector was, which even goddess Aphrodite could do no saving. Homer's thought ferried across through words, through language, takes shape and makes a dent for all warrior wannabes. No guts, no glory. But more importantly, he freed us from the allure of everlasting life, enabling us to appreciate the beauty of mortality. No matter how brute, no matter how arrogant, it was just as painful, losing Achilles, because he's like most of us, selfish, arrogant, vain, until we learn to love and realize that we are humans, mortals. Our time will pass, and we wish, like Achilles, to have achieved something glorious just before we go, and leave a legacy that will make our next of kin proud. Just because of that, we had been to Greece, all for free, all because of the Iliad. The second point, we read the classics because they free us. They emancipate us from all the tyrannies of the world, from ignorance, from apathy. Let us break that down with a little help from Bell Hooks, who is a believer of emancipatory education, which is seemingly natural to the teaching of literature. In Teaching to Transgress, Education is the Practice of Freedom, Bell Hooks said, and I quote, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy." This seems to cohere with what Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who's famous for pedagogy of the oppressed, once postulated in his philosophy of critical pedagogy, instituting love, the radical kind, as the basis of an education that seeks justice, equality, and genius, excerpted from The Primer by Kinchalo in 2004. When we read the classics, we take caution, even when we're aware of the fictionality of it, that it mirrors reality. But we read them anyway, because we're hopeful that it would illumine the dark periods of human history. Racism, slavery, sexism, patriarchy, oppression, colonialism, othering, marginalization, communism, so on and so forth. We could go on. To emancipate, we must participate. This is where we, literature teachers, need to work smarter, if not harder. In order for us to effectively emancipate the classroom from all these tyrannies, we must do our homework, which is to read more fiction, to dig deeper into analyses, to assert scholarship by way of research and collaboration. We must engage with scholars who had intimately consumed the classics for our benefit. Take, for example, the feminist scholar Kate Millett in 1969. Kate Millett examined, open quote, the power structured relationships, arrangements whereby one group of persons is controlled by another. This led her to a groundbreaking discovery of some kind of sexual politics, where sexual domination is a pervasive ideology that seeks to reinforce women's inferiority and incompetence. Reading sexual politics alongside novels such as Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, Kate Chopin's The Awakening, and essays like Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own renders radical shift in the way we view the woman question. From being subjected to prejudice in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter to being the object of desire and male gaze in works like Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov, to being the scorned mad woman in the attic in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, we are compelled to re-examine narratives that amplify othering and eventually reconstitute women as empowered beings. To succeed in this endeavor, a lit teacher should be able to reflect on his or her own biases. One must teach with awareness and recognition of the unconscious bias that have been hardwired by way of indoctrination. When one is to teach the classics, especially in the contemporary times, they should be careful as to impose their ideologies in the guise of interpretations. This is admittedly quite challenging. It asks the teachers, to transcend their own race, gender, class, status, if they are to truly forward emancipation. Let us, for example, assume that we are teaching Shakespeare's Macbeth. How do we begin to analyze the character of Lady Macbeth, who is famous for her soliloquy, Unsex Me Here? It goes, the raven himself is hoarse, that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. What are we to make of that? What kind of woman is Lady Macbeth? Ambitious? Corrupt? Evil? Vile? Why would Shakespeare paint such kind of woman? Shakespeare's women characters, in fact, are, interestingly, some of the strongest suit in classical drama. But are they necessarily empowered? Is Katharina in The Taming of the Shrew empowered in her foul temper and sharp tongue? Is Desdemona in her unyielding loyalty for Othello? Is Rosaline in her gender-bending performance as Ganymede in As You Like It? Is Juliet when she eloped with and eventually married Romeo? There's only one way to find out. Read more Shakespeare and examine all the women characters from a critical lens. But make sure to keep the fun. Fun and enjoyment remains to be the top priority in teaching literature. Most especially the classics. Most especially Shakespeare. Really? You might ask. Shakespeare just happens to be one of the hardest, among the classics to teach. The third reason, we read the classics because they're timeless, boundless, universal. So is Shakespeare. Ever heard about O Romeo, O Like Wow? It's basically a synopsis given by a 14-year-old for her oral report. Part of it goes, open quote, this is like a real super sad play about this dude, Romeo, and this dudette, Juliet. They had names like that because it was like the old days, before MTV. So no one had cool names like Heather or Brandon or Shauna. They all had geeky names like that, like Benvolio, Tybalt, and Mercutio. So anyway, these two families, see, the Montagues and the Capulets, really hate each other. I mean, they can't even walk down the street without crashing on each other because, that's what happens right at the beginning. Such is how a teenager relates Romeo and Juliet, and she is on point because such is the real nature of the Bard's dramas, relatable, timeless, universal. His language, contrary to popular belief, isn't Old English. Neither is it Middle English. It's just English as we know it. When we realize the role that language plays in a text, we will get closer to what a text may actually mean. For most of Shakespeare's work, it's love, and love is a universal language. Finally, what major considerations should we have if we are to teach classics in the contemporary for the contemporary audiences? For this, I humbly propose three things. First, no to censorship. Second, more intertextuality. And third, yes to inter/multidisciplinary and multi/translingual approaches in the classroom. Open quote. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows, like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her at the moment of climax. End quote. Graphic? Morbid? Right. This is from Orwell's 1984, a classic dystopian novel banned in a number of places, not only for the use of sexually charged language, but mainly for its anti-communist content. You see, censorship is a futile exercise. It decries a one-track mind and stifles freedom of thought from flourishing. Usually done by institutions that have huge control mechanisms, these poets, texts, and even characters have once totally disappeared from the pages of history and literature. Thankfully, through the pursuit of literary scholarship, they have, recently been recovered. Making sense of the contemporary times require having the guts to read through the pages of banned classical literatures, for they hold the key to the mysteries of the modern world. When we teach the masterpieces in the class, for instance, we have to take a conscious effort to problem pose existing knowledge, to give way to modern understanding. Why were these books banned in the first place? Were they offensive? Were they anti-religion? Were they oppressive? Once students understand that Animal Farm and the Divine Comedy are allegories about the prevailing ideological systems of the world and what's wrong with them, they would know better than to they would know better about examining power structures that currently affect our lives as citizens of the world. They would know better than to believe in fake news. They would know a dictator when they see one. There just cannot be too much fiction in our veins if they are to make sense, or if we are to make sense of our mundane existence. So, no to literary censorship. Plato thinks it could lead to poisoning the well, but we are in the 21st century, and it is our responsibility as educators to provide that safe space for provocative discussions and use the opportunity to move towards a genuine critical consciousness. Second, heighten intertextual awareness. Intertextuality is intrinsically linked to postmodern understanding. It is realizing how one work relates to another. The classic had much of its energy spent on laying down the foundations of civilization. If we are keen observers, we would have noticed that contemporary writers seem to give a nod to these classical works as they offer their own impressions, arguments, ideas in their works of fiction. The result is always an enriching interplay of old and modern ideas married in a playful, if not mind-boggling, literary text. Remember Budgetan and Tajo Baldissimo's Trece? Not only did they modernize Philippine folklore, they also richly offered intertextual elements with history. So take note. While most texts are intertextual with other texts, there are other texts that are intertextual with other forms of art such as visual arts, film, and even other emerging contemporary art forms. How is Macbeth, for example, intertextually linked with the 2006 Chinese movie The Banquet? Harry Potter with Inferno? What about the vampires we have seen in Twilight? Is Stephanie Meyer parodying Anne Rice's interview with a vampire? Or is Anne Rice challenging Bram Stoker's imaging of Dracula? Finally, seek inter/multidisciplinary relations and allow multi/translingual approaches in your strategies. Yes, That is possible even in the teaching of the classics. Yes, I mean, teaching literature with science or with math, that's possible. What was, for instance, the mathematical probability that Primrose Everdeen would be picked as the tribute in the lottery? Scratch that. I'm kidding. I mean, the Hunger Games. But is the classic The Lottery by Shirley Jackson uh, intertextually related with Suzanne Collins' The Hunger Games? How about history? How do we make people sure that the atrocities and abuses of the martial law years really never happen again? How do we read history? How can reading Celso al Karunungan sa Tanasalupa or Satan on Earth heighten historical competence among the youth so much so that they're able to decide for themselves what to make of that portion of Philippine history? Can we allow them to speak in Filipino when in our world lit classes? When the medium of instruction remains to be English? It is my humble opinion that we should. Translanguaging bears a lot of potential in allowing students to engage deeply and intimately with the classics. We cannot force everyone to do a Shakespeare and produce their own sonnets in iambic pentameter with 10 syllables in a line. But we could certainly channel our inner Shakespeares, that is, our inner poets, if we understand that literature is mostly about human experiences. Take, for instance, this work by Gilbert Sape called Ang Pag-ibig, Alinsunod sa Pakete ng Tide Ultra. It goes, Sabi ko, ayaw kong maglaba sa gabi. Hindi ko alam kung bakit. Siguro'y ayaw kong makitang nakasungaw ang bituin sa ulap at pinapanood ang bawat kong kusot. Pero hindi kagabi. Ang totoo, naglaba ako. Sinamantala ko ang pangulimlim ng bituin sa nangingilid na ulap. At natitiyak ko, maputi ang aking nilabhan. Sinunod ko yata ang bawat instruksyon sa likod ng pakete ng Tide Ultra. Una, kunin sa timba ang damdaming matagal nang ibinabad. Pangalawa, kusutin ng mabuti, pabulain. Pabulain upang matiyak na natatakpan na ng bula ang mga salitang noon pa sana sinabi. Pangatlo, at dahil nahuli na sa sikat ng araw na siyang pinagpulahan o pagkukulahan, lagyan na lamang ng Clorox upang pumupas at walang makakita sa mancha ni Eros. Banlawan, maraming banlaw, at tiyaking maisama sa tubig ang mga sentimiento at panghihinayang. Panglima, ibuhos sa kanalang tubig upang makapagtago sa burak ang mga pagsinta. Pang-anim, isampay sa mahanging lugar ang nilabhang damdamin, pabayaan itong makahinga. Matagal na rin namang naikubli ito sa baul. Pagmamuni-muni pagkatapos, napigaan ko na ang damit. Mariin, nakalimutan ko nga lamang pigaan ang tubig sa aking mata. Paalam muna, samantala'y magpapatuyo muna ako ng damit ng mata. Sana'y walang makakita. Salamat sa pakete ng Tide Ultra. See, they may not be able to write something like Sonnet 116. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds or bends with the remover to remove. But they could create something more personal, a bit more cultural, and especially more meaningful if we realize that language in literature is a beautiful vessel that ferries across the message. As for the classical literary pieces, we know that the message has not changed. As David Levitan puts it, the message is, love is the higher law. Bring it when you teach the classics. This has been a fruitful experience and I thank you for spending time with me. I hope you picked up a few things and realized the treasure trove that is the classics is never a lost cause. Like and share this episode. Again, my name is Erly Parungao Callueng para sa Panitikan at Guro, hoping for a meaningful literature month for all of us. This is PNU Talks.